Imagine waking up to a silence so complete you could hear a horse shift its weight 3 farms away. No engines. No horns. No hum of distant highways. Just wind, birdsong, and the creak of a windmill turning slowly against the sky. For most of American history, this was simply what morning sounded like. And then, in the span of a single generation, it vanished almost entirely. Somewhere in the fading memory of that world is a way of life so different from our own that most of us can barely picture it, a world where the fastest thing a person would ever see move was a horse at full gallop, where a trip of 20 miles could take an entire day, and where the rhythm of daily life was set not by clocks or schedules, but by the sun, the seasons, and the needs of animals who could not be rushed. What was it actually like to live in that world? And what did we lose, and gain, when the automobile finally arrived to break the silence for good? Before we go further, it's worth sitting with just how recent this all was. The automobile did not creep into American life over centuries. It arrived, for most rural communities, within the lifetime of people who could still remember riding in a horse-drawn wagon to town. A person born in 1880 in rural Ohio or Kansas might have spent their childhood in a world essentially unchanged since colonial times, and lived to see men walk on the moon. That is the astonishing scale of what happened. And to understand the automobile's impact, we first have to understand exactly what it replaced. Picture a farm family in the 1880s, somewhere in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania or the flat expanse of Iowa. Their day did not begin with an alarm clock. It began before sunrise, because the animals demanded it. Cows needed milking whether the farmer felt like getting up or not. Chickens needed feeding. Horses needed watering and currying before they could be hitched to any kind of work. In many households, the first hour of the day was already spent in service to creatures who could not tell time, could not wait, and could not be reasoned with. This single fact shaped nearly everything else about rural life. Time itself moved differently when your primary technology was alive, needed rest, could get sick, and had its own limits. Consider something as simple as travel. Today, we think of a trip to the next town as an errand, 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. In 1885, a farmer needing to reach a town 12 miles away faced a genuine undertaking. A horse pulling a loaded wagon on a dirt road, especially after rain, might average 4 to 6 miles an hour. That 12-mile trip could easily consume most of a day once you accounted for loading goods, the journey itself, conducting business in town, and the return trip home before dark. And dark mattered enormously, because roads without any lighting became genuinely dangerous once the sun went down. Wheels could catch in ruts. Horses could stumble. A wrong turn in unfamiliar country at night could mean real trouble. So life organized itself around daylight in a way that is almost impossible for us to fully grasp now, when a flick of a switch banishes darkness instantly. This distance-based isolation is one of the most underappreciated aspects of rural life before cars. We often imagine these communities as close-knit, and in many ways they were, but close was relative. A neighbor 5 miles away was, in practical terms, further from you than someone across the country is today, in terms of the effort required to actually see them. Visiting family who lived even 15 or 20 miles distant might happen only a few times a year. Courtship between young people in different townships could involve enormous logistical planning. Weddings, funerals, and gatherings pulled entire communities together in part because they were rare enough events to justify the difficulty of getting there. And what about the roads themselves? This is where the story gets genuinely difficult to imagine. Before state and federal highway systems existed in any meaningful form, most rural roads in America were simply dirt, maintained inconsistently by local township requirements that often obligated farmers to contribute labor, literally shoveling, grading, and clearing, a certain number of days each year just to keep the roads passable. In spring, when snow melted and rain fell, many of these roads became nearly impassable seas of mud. Wagon wheels could sink deep enough to trap a horse. Farmers dreaded what they simply called mud season, a period that could last weeks and effectively cut off communities from easy travel. It's a detail that rarely makes it into popular imagination of the era, but it defined entire months of the year for millions of people. Given all this, how did rural communities function at all? The answer lies in something we've largely lost: radical self-sufficiency paired with tightly bound local networks. A rural household in this era typically grew much of its own food, raised its own animals for meat and dairy, made or mended much of its own clothing, and produced many of its own tools. Trips to town were not for daily needs, they were for specific, planned purposes: selling crops or livestock, buying items that genuinely could not be made at home like coffee, sugar, certain tools, or fabric, and conducting whatever legal or financial business required a bank or a courthouse. The general store in the nearest town functioned as something far more significant than a place to buy goods. It was often the community's information hub, a place where news, however delayed, made its way from the wider world into local conversation. Newspapers arrived days or even weeks late in more remote areas, carried by stagecoach or, later, by rail to the nearest depot, and then distributed further by whatever local transport existed. Someone in a truly isolated area might learn of a presidential election result, a major disaster, or an international event only after significant delay, sometimes only when the next mail delivery arrived. And that brings us to the mail itself, which deserves real attention, because it was arguably the single most important thread connecting isolated rural households to the outside world. Before rural free delivery was established by the United States Post Office in 1896 and expanded significantly over the following 2 decades, many rural families had to travel considerable distances just to collect mail from a post office, sometimes located in a general store or even a private home designated as a mail stop. Speaking of catalogs, this is a fascinating and often overlooked piece of the puzzle. Companies like Montgomery Ward, founded in 1872, and Sears, Roebuck and Company, which began its catalog business in the 1890s, understood something crucial about rural isolation: farm families were often starved for access to goods that city dwellers took for granted. These catalogs became genuinely beloved objects in rural households, pored over by lamplight, offering everything from clothing to furniture to, eventually, entire mail-order houses that could be built from a kit shipped by rail. In a world without easy travel to shopping districts, the catalog was, in a very real sense, an early substitute for the marketplace itself, a way of bringing the wider world's goods to people who could not easily go out and get them. But let's return to the texture of daily life itself, because the absence of automobiles shaped far more than shopping and travel. It shaped courtship, medicine, education, and even how communities dealt with emergencies. Consider medical care. A doctor serving a rural county in the 1880s or 1890s might be responsible for patients spread across dozens of square miles. When someone fell seriously ill or was injured, sending for the doctor meant dispatching a rider on horseback, and then waiting, sometimes for hours, for that doctor to travel by horse and buggy to the patient's home. In genuine emergencies, this delay could be the difference between life and death. Many rural doctors of this era became legendary in their communities not just for their medical skill, but for their willingness to travel through blizzards, floods, and pitch darkness because there was simply no faster way to reach a patient. Doctors kept horses bred and trained specifically for this kind of demanding, all-weather travel, and a good doctor's horse was considered a genuinely valuable asset. Schooling, too, was shaped entirely by the limits of foot and horse travel. The one-room schoolhouse, an image now etched into American nostalgia, existed largely because children could realistically walk only so far each day. School districts were drawn small and numerous specifically so that no child would have to travel more than a mile or 2 on foot, particularly through harsh winter weather. This meant an enormous number of small, independently operated schools scattered across the countryside, each serving perhaps a dozen to 30 children across multiple grade levels simultaneously, taught by a single teacher who was often barely out of her teens herself. Now, here's a detail that might genuinely surprise you: courtship and romance in this era were profoundly shaped by transportation limits in ways that shaped entire life trajectories. A young person's pool of potential spouses was, in a very real sense, defined by how far a horse could comfortably travel and return within a day or an evening. This is part of why so many rural marriages in this period occurred between people from neighboring farms or nearby townships, not necessarily out of narrow-mindedness, but out of simple logistics. Courting someone 25 miles away meant an enormous investment of time, and likely required staying overnight with relatives or family friends along the way, which itself required a level of social coordination and trust that added real friction to any long-distance romance. Now, let's talk about the sensory experience of this world, because it's genuinely difficult for modern audiences to imagine just how quiet, and how dark, rural America actually was. Without engines, without electric lighting in most homes until well into the early 20th century in many rural areas, and without the constant low hum of machinery we now take for granted, nights in rural America were profoundly dark and profoundly silent. Stars were visible in a way that is almost unimaginable to most Americans today, given how much artificial light now washes out the night sky even in fairly rural areas. Sound carried enormous distances. A dog barking, a rooster crowing, a wagon wheel creaking on a distant road, these sounds could travel for miles across open country in the stillness of night, and rural residents often developed an acute sensitivity to these sounds, able to identify who was approaching a farm simply by the particular creak of their wagon or the gait of their horse. This quiet also meant something else worth considering. Rural Americans of this era lived with a kind of environmental awareness that modern life has largely erased. Weather wasn't something you checked on a screen, it was something you read in the sky, in the behavior of animals, in the smell of the air. Farmers developed deep, practical knowledge of cloud formations, wind shifts, and seasonal patterns because their entire livelihood depended on correctly anticipating what nature was about to do. A sudden change in wind direction or a particular color at sunset carried real, actionable information, passed down through generations of careful observation. So if this world was so isolated, so slow, so bound by the limits of animal power, why do so many who lived through it, or who study it now, describe it with something close to reverence? Part of the answer lies in what that slowness actually produced: deep, durable community bonds. Because travel was difficult, when people did gather, for church, for harvest, for a barn raising, for a wedding, those gatherings mattered enormously, and communities invested real effort in making them meaningful. Barn raisings in particular deserve mention here, because they represent something genuinely remarkable about rural cooperation before automobiles made it easy to simply hire outside labor. When a farmer's barn burned down or a new one was needed, neighbors from surrounding farms would gather, sometimes traveling considerable distances, to complete the entire structure in a single day through coordinated group labor, men framing and raising the structure while women prepared enormous communal meals. It was, in a very real sense, a technology of its own, a social technology that substituted collective human effort for the machinery and hired labor that would later make such gatherings unnecessary. Church served a similarly powerful unifying function. For many rural communities, Sunday services were not simply religious observance, they were the primary weekly occasion when scattered families reliably saw one another, exchanged news, arranged future visits, and reinforced the social bonds that held isolated communities together. The physical effort required to attend, hitching the wagon, dressing the family, traveling however many miles to the nearest church, meant that attendance represented a genuine commitment, and the gathering afterward, often extending well beyond the service itself into conversation and shared meals, was treasured precisely because it was rare. Now, it's important not to romanticize this world too completely, because it came with real and serious hardships that we should not gloss over. Isolation could be genuinely dangerous, and not just in medical emergencies. Winter storms could trap families for days or weeks with limited supplies. Crop failures in an era before modern insurance or extensive government relief programs could mean genuine desperation, with no quick way to travel to seek help or alternative work. Women in particular often faced profound isolation, especially on more remote farms, spending days or even weeks with limited adult social contact beyond their immediate family, a reality that contributed to documented struggles with what people at the time sometimes called prairie madness or severe loneliness, particularly among women who had moved to remote frontier areas from more populated regions. This is a part of the story that deserves honest acknowledgement alongside the nostalgia. The same slowness and distance that fostered deep community bonds when people could gather also produced real suffering when they could not. So what actually began to change this world, before the automobile itself arrived to finish the job? The railroad deserves real credit here as the first major disruption to rural isolation. By the mid to late 1800s, rail lines were expanding rapidly across the American landscape, and even communities that never saw a train pass directly through them were affected by proximity to a rail line, because it meant goods, mail, and news could travel to a nearby depot far faster than ever before, then be distributed onward by the older, slower methods of horse and wagon. The railroad essentially created a network of faster connection points scattered across a landscape that otherwise still moved at the old pace, and rural communities often organized themselves quite deliberately around access to these points. A farm's value could shift noticeably based on its proximity to a rail depot. The telegraph, running alongside many of these same rail lines, represented an even more startling change, because for the first time in human history, information itself could travel faster than any physical object or person. A rural resident might still take a full day to travel to the county seat, but news from that same county seat, or from across the country, could now arrive via telegraph to the local depot in mere minutes. This created a strange and genuinely new experience for rural Americans, living in a world where information now moved at a completely different speed than people and goods did, a gap that had simply never existed before in human history at this scale. And then, gradually, came the automobile. It's worth noting that the change was not instantaneous, contrary to how we sometimes imagine it in hindsight. Early automobiles, in the final years of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th, were expensive, unreliable, and genuinely impractical for rural roads that had been designed, if they were designed at all, for horses and wagons rather than motor vehicles. Rural roads were often too muddy, too rutted, and too poorly maintained for these early, fragile machines. In fact, for years, automobiles were largely viewed by many rural Americans as a novelty for wealthy urban enthusiasts rather than a practical tool for farm life. Horses, meanwhile, could navigate mud and rough terrain that stranded early cars entirely, and there are countless documented instances of farmers using their horses to literally pull stuck automobiles out of the very mud that their horses handled with ease. The true turning point arrived with Henry Ford's Model T, introduced in 1908, and even more significantly with the moving assembly line innovations Ford implemented starting in 1913, which dramatically reduced production costs and, as a result, the purchase price. What had been a luxury item suddenly became something an increasing number of American families, including rural farm families, could realistically save up for and purchase. By the 1910s and accelerating dramatically through the 1920s, automobile ownership expanded at a startling pace across rural America, fundamentally altering the calculations that had governed rural life for generations. Consider what this actually meant in practical terms. That 12-mile trip to town that once consumed most of a day could now be accomplished in perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. Medical emergencies that once required an agonizing wait for a doctor traveling by horse and buggy could now potentially be addressed by a car reaching town, or a doctor reaching the patient, in a fraction of the previous time. Courtship possibilities expanded dramatically as the practical radius of who a young person might realistically meet and continue seeing grew from a few miles to dozens of miles almost overnight. Small, scattered one-room schoolhouses gradually began consolidating into larger, centralized schools, since students could now be transported greater distances relatively quickly, an early form of what would eventually become the yellow school bus system familiar to generations of American children. This shift required enormous, coordinated public investment as well, something rarely discussed alongside the romantic mythology of the open road. The Federal Aid Road Act of 1916 marked one of the first major federal commitments to funding road improvements specifically because it became clear that America's existing dirt road network, adequate for horses, was wholly inadequate for the automobile age. Over the following decades, a massive, sustained national effort transformed rural roads from often impassable dirt paths into the graded, and eventually paved, network that we now take entirely for granted every time we drive anywhere in the country. But alongside all these practical gains, something else was quietly disappearing, and it's worth pausing to consider what was genuinely lost in this transition, not simply as an exercise in nostalgia, but as an honest reckoning with change. The tight, almost forced intimacy of small rural communities, the kind that emerged specifically because people couldn't easily leave or travel elsewhere, began to loosen. Young people who once would have stayed within a tight local radius, marrying neighbors and inheriting family farms, now had the mobility to leave for cities, for different opportunities, for lives that would have simply been geographically impossible just a generation earlier. This mobility brought real opportunity, but it also began the long, gradual process of rural population decline that has continued, with fits and starts, across much of the 20th and 21st centuries, as automobiles made it possible for people to leave in ways that had never been practical before. The particular quality of rural silence and darkness that had defined nighttime for centuries also began to change, gradually but unmistakably, as engine noise became a more regular feature of the rural soundscape, and as electrification, following closely behind and often intertwined with automobile-driven infrastructure development, brought artificial light to areas that had known only lamplight, starlight, and moonlight for generations. The particular kind of environmental attentiveness that rural life had demanded, reading weather in the sky, recognizing a neighbor's wagon by sound alone, gradually became less essential as life sped up and technology increasingly buffered people from direct dependence on these older forms of perception and knowledge. It's genuinely worth sitting with the scale of this transformation, because it happened within a remarkably compressed span of time. A person born into the world of horse-drawn isolation in, say, 1885, could realistically have lived to see paved highways, radio broadcasts reaching directly into rural farmhouses, and eventually even television, all within a single lifetime. Few generations in human history have witnessed such a fundamental reordering of daily life, of distance, of time itself, compressed into so few decades. The automobile did not simply provide faster transportation. It fundamentally altered how Americans experienced space, community, isolation, and connection, in ways whose full consequences we are arguably still living through and still, in some sense, still working out today. What remains of that older world now exists mostly in memory, in old photographs, in the occasional preserved one-room schoolhouse turned into a small museum, in the family stories still passed down about a grandmother's account of a 12-mile wagon trip to town, or a grandfather's memory of the first automobile he ever saw rumble down a dirt road, startling every horse within sight. It was a world defined by limits that we can now barely imagine living within, limits of distance, of speed, of light, of information. And yet within those very limits, something else flourished, a particular kind of community bond, a particular relationship with the natural world, and a particular rhythm of life that, once gone, could never quite be recreated in the faster, louder, more connected world that replaced it. Here's a question worth sitting with: if you had grown up in that older, slower, quieter world, one built around genuine limits on distance and speed, but also around deeper, more necessary community bonds, do you think you would have wanted the automobile to arrive as quickly as it did, or would you have wanted to hold on to that older rhythm of life a little longer? Share your honest answer in the comments below.